Welcome to Interplay. This is Michael Shapiro, your host, today with my special friend and guest, violinist and teacher. We'll get to that part. Jennifer Roig-Francoli. Thank you for joining me.
Hey, Michael. Thank you so much for having me. It's something I've been looking forward to for a while. So
that's great.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to talk about some new recorded issues you've got going on right now that people can purchase or listen to on all the major platforms. But before we get to that, we see a violin behind you. Now, I know that you have years of study and professional experience behind you. You even had studied profoundly with Nathan Milstein. And when I first heard you play, I said to you, what amazing intonation you have. I'm not the big bad wolf, you know. This is the big bad composer, conductor talking. Talk to us about why do you have, as so many others do not, the most incredible intonation that I have ever heard since Nathan Milstein.
Well, I do actually credit Nathan Milstein very much for my intonation. Honestly, I don't think much about my intonation, and I find it funny that you always tell me I have such good intonation. but truly, I had the great fortune to study with Nathan Milstein for 5 summers from the time I was 12, through my teenage years. And that was in Switzerland. My mother's side of the family is Swiss. And so that was really wonderful. And one thing that really stood out from what I learned from him was how he insisted that it was not possible to have good intonation if you couldn't play without vibrato. And so I remember him insisting that I practice my scales and everything that I played without vibrato, because otherwise you can't hear if you're in tune or not. You need to be able to hit the note in tune at first, instead of what many people do is they hit the note and then vibrate immediately, and then you can sort of fudge and get away with not having, accurate vibrato intonation. And then playing the Baroque violin is another thing that really helped me with my intonation, because for the same reason we learn to play without vibrato, which many modern musicians actually are not able to do right away. It's hard to turn it off for a lot of
exactly correct. Violins. Now, let's talk about portamento, for example. What people call slides, the space between notes. The ability to play portamento, I think, has gone away in many ways. Don't you agree?
Yeah, although I do see it starting to come back, because I have this sense that nowadays there is so much more openness to individuals choosing their own way. And we are the first, well, not me, but like my son, for instance, who's 19, he's also a violinist. And he told me the other day, the obvious, that it hadn't occurred to me before, that he's the first generation that is able to listen to everything. I mean, when I was a kid, we had LPs, and I had a very limited number of LPs, including Nathan Milstein and the other great violinists. But now there's YouTube, there's Spotify, there's Apple iTunes, there's everything. And all of the old masters have been uploaded, as well as new people. I mean, there's just so much. And so young people are able to listen to all kinds of interpretations. So
germane to that, I just sent you fairly recently for your son, Inescu and Menuhin playing the Bach double concerto.
Yes, and actually he had, believe it or not, already listened to that, and he agrees with you totally that it is just heavenly. And it is. It's just really special.
I've always said the second movement of that particular recording is literally looking into the eyes of God through Bach.
Yeah, and for me, Bach has always been that. It's my favorite way to connect musically. Well, one of my favorite ways to connect to God, spirit, my true self, my heart, through Bach. I love Bach. So
Bach, to use an Alexander technique word, is our cycle.
Right.
True,
Well,
isn't
and
it?
Bach, I've been playing the Bach chaconne since I was 18, 19, and it's one of the few pieces that I have kept in my fingers and
Right.
played regularly all these years. And it's the first piece that I've recorded now as a
We'll get
soloist.
to that in
So,
a second
yeah.
on all major platforms. That's really something to listen to. I actually heard the Bach Chaconne live played by Milstein. My uncle and aunt took me to hear him. It was really an
Ah,
all Bach evening.
what a gift.
Solo Bach. Oh my God. Let's talk about process.
Mhm.
Now, I know you played the Bach Chaconne, the great piece of Bach, solo violin, for most of your life.
Yeah.
But let's say, I know for the recent recording that you did, what was your process? How did you attack a piece that you've played all these years? You've gone through so much. You're a soloist. You're an orchestral player. You're a teacher. You're a mother. You're a spouse. You're a friend.
Was a spouse.
Well, kind of now again a little bit, whatever. But you know what I'm
I'm
saying.
a partner now.
Well, that's what they call it. You know, I hate those terms. In any event, you're with someone.
That's right. Thanks.
You've partnered, as they say in Brooklyn.
Right.
The point of the matter is, what's your process in approaching either a piece you've played your entire life, like the chaconne, or it's something new that maybe you didn't know before?
Well, I'll tell you that every single time I play anything is completely different from any other time I've played it. And ideally, great art is like that. I think that's how I think of it. It ought to be spontaneous, but of course, it's informed by my whole life experience. And talking about the Bach chaconne in particular, I learned. I'll tell you a short story that's kind of funny. One of my other teachers was Joseph Gingold at Indiana University. And when I was at IU, I was studying both with him and Stanley Ritchie, who is the great Baroque violin pedagogue. And Joseph Gingold could not understand at all why anybody would want to play the Baroque violin. He's like, Jennifer, why would a pretty girl like you want to play the Baroque violin? It was funny because Joseph Gingold was a loving, wonderful person.
He was.
But then, so I learned how to play it in two completely different styles with two completely different instruments. And when I played for Gingold's masterclass one day, I wasn't sure how I wanted to play it. So I just played it the way I wanted to in that moment, which was in Baroque style on modern violin. And he listened very graciously to the whole thing. And then afterwards told me to sit down. He said, Jennifer, have a seat. And he started, he started to tell me, Jennifer, I really admire your conviction. And this was great. This was wonderful. This was wonderful. This was great. And now, please do me the favor and play it again the right way.
The right way. All right,
and
Jennifer.
so everyone laughed, including me, and I played it again the way that he would have wanted me to play it.
Now, stop 1 second, please. We got to go to this.
Yes.
Gingold was a great teacher, very famous man as far as violinist and orchestras. What did he mean by the quotes right way?
Well, I mean, I completely understand where he was coming from. I don't remember exactly how old he was, but he was close to 90 at the time where I was working with him. It was in his last years. And he was an old style romantic musician. And that is a wonderful, beautiful way to be. And it just didn't make sense for him, this newfangled way of approaching Baroque music, looking at old treatises and things. He just wasn't interested in that. And it sounded wrong to him. And as it did to many other people, I auditioned for Marlborough at like a year or two after that. And I was yelled at when I played it the way I liked it, which was more in Baroque style on modern violin. I was really reprimanded and said, is that what they teach you at Indiana University? I mean, at that time, it was not mainstream to be, I mean, now you turn on the radio and you hear Baroque music on Baroque instruments, on original instruments. At the time where I was studying it, it was fringe, even though it wasn't.
No, I understand.
So that's where he was coming from, and I don't blame.
It remains a very controversial subject.
I think much less so, though.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah. But your
I love
process,
it. Anyway, back to how I play it, right?
how do
I
you approach
record.
that piece? What do you do?
Well, I have decided that I'm just going to do what I like, and I don't care what anybody else thinks. So the way I play Bach now is just how I love it, how it's how I feel it in the moment, which is informed by the old romantic style of playing on a modern violin. I don't like to play Bach that way anymore, though, because I've gone through decades of playing Baroque music on original instruments. I love playing the Bach chaconne in that style on a Baroque violin. But I decided to play this piece on the modern violin for this recording. And you know what? A week before I recorded it, I suddenly had this intuition that I wanted to change the pitch of my violin. So I tuned it down. I experimented with different pitches. My modern violin does not like 415, like A415, like my Baroque violin does. And so I tried other things and I settled on 432, which my violin absolutely loves. And I felt so good playing it at that pitch. I don't know anybody else who plays Bach at 432, and it kind of goes against the grain, but I don't care. So,
okay, I don't care.
So my style is very much like a Baroque interpretation, but it's on a modern
though
violin.
to the listeners, because lay people watch this, I hope, and you listen to this on podcasts on Apple. What is playing it in a Baroque style mean?
Well, when I was at IU and I took Baroque lessons from Stanley Ritchie, we would often spend a whole lesson on one line of music, and he would teach me in detail about the articulations of the period. Way back in Bach's time, the way that you used a bow, which was a Baroque bow at that time, a completely different shape. It causes a different kind of sound. And so your notes tend to be shaped in a different way just because of how the bow is created and how it interacts with a Baroque violin, which is a really different instrument. So overall, it's maybe a softer, deeper, more resonant sound with a shorter articulation that has more shape in the sense that maybe a long note will swell, it'll grow in the middle and decrescendo or get a little softer towards the end. It's more based on rhythm, more strict dance-like rhythm than a modern interpretation or a romantic interpretation, which is a longer, people in the Romantic period were going for long lines where you couldn't tell the difference between a down bow and an up bow. And so, the way you play, it's a complete paradigm shift in how you approach Baroque music with that kind of an instrument.
It's very illustrative for people who don't know the difference. I know that there was a conductor I encountered a few years back who told a modern orchestra when he was doing Beethoven's symphony, no vibrato at all in the Beethoven symphony. And I thought that was an extraordinarily simplistic answer.
And I bet they couldn't do it either.
Oh, it sounded horrible.
Well, in the Baroque period, vibrato was done. It was used, but it was an ornament. It was created. You used vibrato really intentionally to add, luster or a special effect to long notes, especially so that something would stand out and you'd have a little different color, and you could have a fast vibrato and slow vibrato, and it stood out and made something special instead of, it's like if you eat cake every day, it's not special anymore.
Ooh. When would you use slow vibrato versus long vibrato? And explain to our listeners what that is.
Well, if you're not a string player and you don't know what vibrato is, when you wiggle your finger, your left hand, the finger that touches the instrument, actually, you can slightly bend a note. You can move your finger just a very little bit, like a millimeter or so in either direction, which makes it sound like the note gets a little more sharp or flat, and it just gives it a little bit of a vibrational quality that it's a different vibrational quality.
Right.
It also increases you can project more in a certain way if you use vibrato.
But the difference between a romantic vibrato and a Baroque vibrato is what?
Well, I think it's not so much in the vibrato itself as in how and when you use the vibrato.
How it's articulated, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, ideally, with a modern instrument, I want to have an incredible amount of, different types of vibrato at my disposal. That's how I was taught. I was taught to develop a very slow vibrato, fast vibrato, narrow vibrato, wide vibrato, and everything in between, but to have a really clear intention for how to use the vibrato to create certain effects in the music, like emotionally. And unfortunately, I think a lot of that nuance has been lost in
Let's talk about that
modern
process for a second, and then we're going to go into your new recording. Let's take the second movement of the Bach double, which we just talked about right before, about the Ionescu Menuhin, very romantic recording of the 1920s, when, Menuhin was literally in kid pants and Ionescu was an older guy, and they had this incredible performance. The second movement has a melody, a falling melody, which is aped by between the instruments. Sure. Okay. How would a romantic player first play that?
Well, you would play it in such a way that it feels like a tapestry that just continues. It's like an endless ocean.
Uninterrupted, right?
Yeah, you want these different lines to overlap, that it's just seamless and like a sea of sound.
Romantic player, lots of vibrato.
Yeah.
On pretty much every note. Okay?
Right.
Now, what would a Baroque player play that?
Well, for one thing, it would probably be quite a bit faster. And there's just more... it's hard to put into words, honestly. I think.
Well, that's why I'm asking. This is a word.
Yeah.
We can't. I didn't ask you to play today, but no, it's something I'm fascinated by.
And I have performed this with Apollo's Fire as the soloist in New York, actually, years ago. We did our debut there. Yeah, and what's the difference? Well, it's a little faster, and
so it's
you're bringing out different. You're bringing out the dissonances for one thing, which you always want to do in Baroque music. They stress the dissonances, and the most important thing is the harmony in Baroque music, whereas the melody and the line is much more important in a modern or romantic interpretation. And just that primary distinction makes the sound completely different. Wow. And so if you've got two voices together, you really want to bring out the main melody, of course, but as the second violinist, you really want to be, stressing where you're at dissonance with the first violin, and you're just bringing out all those special moments in a way you wouldn't otherwise.
So we go from process of studying scores in Romantic and Baroque eras and modern eras to your most recent recordings, which are marvelous, of Bach and Isai and Ionescu. So let's talk about why you did this, what have you done, and where people can hear it. Take us through it.
Well, honestly, I'm just so thrilled that I've been able to make this happen for myself. I turned 50 this year, and I've always wanted to, since I was a child, I just knew that I wanted to create solo recordings someday. And last year I thought, I'm turning 50. If I'm not going to do it now, when am I going to do it? I better just get to it. And that was about half a year before the pandemic hit, when I started taking action on this lifelong dream. I contacted an engineer and producer in Cleveland, Ohio, and talked about how we might do it. And I started practicing in earnest with this in mind. Then when the pandemic hit, I had been trying to decide whether to do this in a studio in Cleveland, in Cincinnati, or from my home. And that was decided for me by the pandemic, when it became obvious that I needed to create my own home recording studio. Now, I knew nothing about how to record on my own, even though I've played on professional recordings many times before with ensembles. But this is the first time I just decided to do it all myself. So I bought the acoustic panels you can see behind me, hired an engineer to consult with on the sound for the space. I bought a ton of tech equipment. I had to learn the software. And then finally I did it. I had a producer in Cleveland and I found an engineer in Virginia. And I learned how to do it remotely with them so that I was actually in charge of the recording here with my equipment and communicating remotely on Zoom and through audio movers and apps so she could hear in real time without the latency problem. And we did it. So we did the Bach, we did the whole partita, and then we did the Isai together. And then at that point, I realized I could do it by myself. So a few months later, I took on the project of recording the Enescu Saraband by myself without a producer or engineer. And I've just sent that recording to an engineer to do the editing because I'm not interested in learning how to do that. So he'll do the editing and the mastering.
Terrific.
He's already done most of it, so it's almost ready to go. But then the way it is these days is I was advised to release one thing at a time. Mm-hmm. So I've released the Chacon. The Isai is coming out on, I believe, June 11th. It will be released, and it can be pre-saved now through Spotify. And then the Enescu probably in a couple months, and I might do one more Chrysler piece. I'm not sure yet. But in the fall, I'm going to release the full album. And I just can't tell you how happy I am that I was able to figure out how to do this. And I'm just really happy with the result. I hope people will really enjoy this creation, which is true to my heart.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Jennifer, I do have questions regarding your other work that you do. And let's talk about that.
You're talking about my Art of Freedom method for conscious living and masterful artistry.
Yeah, I met you actually. I met you actually through our colleague Tim Fain, the great violinist.
Yes.
Who I've written many pieces for, as you know, and that's how we met. And then I spent about 6 months working with you on Alexander technique, and you are my teacher.
Yeah, it was so much fun.
Yes, it was. You're an amazing teacher, and anyone watching this can see how communicative and deeply wonderful you are. Let's talk about Alexander technique. For those who don't know what that is, what is Alexander technique?
The $1 million question. The Alexander technique is a mind-body system, discipline, that helps you become more conscious of how you're thinking and how your thoughts influence your body and your movements and the activities that you engage in. Anything from walking the dog to doing the dishes to playing the Bach Chacon, or in your case, conducting the BBC, right?
Well, what can I do?
Right. So this system helps you to identify ways in which you're thinking that get in the way of your natural design and spontaneous creative flow, so that whatever you decide to do with yourself, it becomes easier, more effortless, and definitely more fun. You get better at whatever you're doing with less effort.
I think it's
pretty miraculous. I love it.
I think you're right, because I think for those people who are skeptic, this is not voodoo. This is for real.
Oh, yeah. And it's so simple, it's ridiculous.
It's simple, and it also is directly related to who we are in our essence. If you look at my grandsons, they're practicing Alexander technique every second. They haven't forgotten how to practice total relaxation, total everything of every But then, as people grow older, we tense up and we let the mind tell us what to do. That's right. As I mentioned to you, I've used many of the techniques that you've taught me. You're a great teacher.
Oh, and it's all online, by the way. Otherwise we wouldn't have been able to work together.
Yeah, we've never physically met, which we will remedy.
Yes,
But
I'm sure.
I hope. But it has not only helped me in performing, which I'm looking forward to using the etudes that we've discussed, like Scarecrow and the Cycle and so many other things, before I go out and perform.
Right.
Great,
And yeah,
great.
actually, I'll just interject that those things that you just mentioned, like the Cycle, for instance,
Yeah.
that's directly, it's actually a primal Alexander etude.
Right.
It's in the hands-free method that I teach by Mio Morales.
Right. Which I had Alexander training, as you know, previously with Farkas, who's wonderful, when I studied years ago with up at Bard with Harold Farberman, so over 20 years ago. And Farkas is magnificent.
Yes, colleague of mine. Yeah, he's wonderful.
But he's a hands-on type.
Yeah.
You've taught me other things, which I know that you and Mio have developed, which are various ways of getting to the root of who we are physically and mentally and paving the way. One thing that I did find, which I told you I've used, and it's really working over and over again, I found in composing, apart from conducting, I found that in composing, it's sometimes I would reach a kind of crunch in my head and I would fold into myself and I was unable to continue because ideas weren't coming to me fast enough or right or correct. And since I've been using these techniques, a basic of trying to calm myself, and it's succeeding, and also not letting this work as much as the ear and the spirit and the sense and all that stuff, composing's become so much easier.
That's wonderful.
No, it's a big success. And
I think inspiration is natural. I think the creative process is natural, and it shouldn't be hard, and it should be easy and enjoyable, and it certainly shouldn't be painful.
Painful. Now let's get to that because that was my next question. Many of the etudes and studies that you have in the classes that you give are to performing players.
Yes.
And you talk
I
to them.
specialize in teaching musicians. Yeah.
Right. And you talk about the release of pain through using many of these techniques. Could you give an illustration of that?
Yeah. Well, most people who do come to me for help, musicians, are experiencing excess tension in their whole systems. And very often it's manifesting to the point that they are in pain, like they have tendonitis or back pain, neck pain, carpal tunnel, you name it. And most people think that if you have physical pain, you have a physical problem. And if you're feeling physical pain in a certain specific area of the body, that's where the problem is. So they go to a doctor or a chiropractor or some other kind of specialist who is going to focus on the physical body. And especially they're going to focus on that specific part of the body where you're feeling it. And very often there is actually something physical wrong, but it is never just a physical issue. And there was actually a study done in 2012, I believe, in Australia, that really came to the conclusion that any kind of treatment that only addresses the physical body is unlikely to be really successful because people who experience physical pain also have an emotional component to it,
right,
and the thoughts are part of it. So any kind of treatment needs to also address the mental and emotional aspects, like performance anxiety, depression, which so many artists experience.
Yeah.
So the great, wonderful thing about this work that I'm teaching, and especially the Primal Alexander part of it, is that it's so quick that on day one, when I work with my students, they are able to discover that they can think differently to get different results. And almost universally on day one, somebody with pain can start to feel hopeful because they realize that there's something they can do to shift their thinking that relieves the pain slightly. I'm not even sure I've ever worked with anybody personally who wasn't able to do this and recognize that there was potential there for them healing themselves
No question.
through doing this process. It's so simple,
Last
but
point
very
before
powerful.
I know. I'm a believer. And not only a believer, it's so useful. Useful, Jennifer.
Yeah. I just had a student, I'll just tell you really briefly, you asked for an example. I have a student who is a professional cellist, and she just started my program. It's called the Musician's Advantage Jumpstart Program. It's a short 30-day intensive. She had done 2 years of hands-on Alexander work with a teacher. She's done Feldenkrais. She's done almost daily yoga for years. She's tried everything. She's a music educator. She's a great teacher, great cellist, and yet she was having pain. So she found my program, and literally, I just posted to Facebook about this. She wrote that 1.5 weeks into my program, she was pain-free.
That's great.
Yeah. I am humbled. I'm in awe at what's possible when people decide to think differently.
Well,
and
I hope
everybody
understands why there's no pain when you speak to Jennifer Roig-Francoli.
You're sweet.
Thank you so much for joining me and our audience on Interplay, Conversation and Music.
Thank you so much, Michael. I love talking to you. And now when you turn off the recording, we're going to catch up.
We're going to certainly catch up. Thanks again so to Jennifer Roig-Francoli for joining us on Interplay, Conversations and Music. I'm your host, Michael Shapiro.